Everyone, and welcome to this talk. Today we have Albaik joining us. And for those that are attending us for the first time, I'm Salama Emerging. I'm an artist based in Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates. And this series was a way, this was created as a way in the beginning of quarantine, an attempt to engage with the local art community and those that are based abroad but showcased regularly here. It was a way to provide an artist-focused forum to initiate conversation and share our practices and processes as visual artists together. And first and foremost, it was out of my own curiosity as well to connect with other artists and to constantly learn more. And these sessions are recorded, so you can go back to them anytime on YouTube as well. And with that, I hope the conversations continue beyond this session as well. And I think today is our 9th episode, so really excited about that. So moving on to today's talk, as I mentioned, we have Mace with us, and she's going to start off by talking about her practice. And following that, we're going to have a Q&A section. So if you would like to say your question out loud, you can unmute yourself after. But if you don't feel comfortable, you can also use the chat box. And to give a little bit of a background about our guest today, Mace Albaik's interdisciplinary visual practice has literary writing at its heart. Crystalizing as performance, video, and spatial installations, her work seeks to assert a connection to a location through the study of literary fauna, of poetic production that is as tied to land as rooted plants. She holds an MFA from Rhode Island School of Design and a Bachelor's of Architecture from the American University of Sharjah. As an alumna of Salama Emerging Artist Fellowship, also known as SEAF, and currently part of this year's Tashkeel Critical Practice Program, she has participated in both local and international exhibitions, including BWWB and Helix Art Gallery in Brooklyn, New York, Mind the Gap in Tashkeel, Dubai, and Change Coordinates plus Someone Else in 1971 Design Space Sharjah. Just to name a few, Mace's practice developed out of the oral telling of her family's history and the story of her grandfather's exile from Palestine, and the winding path through geopolitical and cultural landscapes that led to where she is now, a non-citizen resident of her country of birth. So that gives a little teaser to Mace's practice, but she's going to go into more detail. And with that, if you'd like to share your screen. Yeah.
Okay, let's get this going. Second. Does everybody see a dreary gray screen?
Yep.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you so much, Saida, for the invite, for the intro, and also for just hosting all these wonderful series. I feel really, I just, I feel so happy that I am here in the company of everybody else that you've hosted, and I'm so happy to see so many familiar faces and names in the audiences. And with that, I'm just gonna dive in. I'm gonna start with a little excerpt from Fred Moten's poetry collection titled The Little Edges. You want sensory issues. Curate the sound you make by jumping. Flap your hands before your eyes. In lengthening, become from another country. Imitate the movement, but expel more air. Say this is your house and run a lap in it, but dance with the air immediately around the ones who seem at home. Repeat a word or phrase slightly louder. Up, 3 steps, then down, like a color block in a Hoffman painting. For a minute, say every letter of every word, but slowly. Hold somebody's hand up to your ear. So today I'm going to walk you through how in my practice I kind of look at language, not just to assert, but also kind of investigate a connection to place. I'm going to specifically be tracing work that looked at places I am removed from, namely Palestine and Syria. But I think before I kind of dive into it, I think it's really important to keep in mind that while we tend to make these kind of our affinities to places that are distant from us, generally the loudest parts of ourselves. I think we really need, or at least I know I do in my practice, really need to start paying more attention to kind of our current experience. And I feel like to reduce our experiences of multiple placehoods to just being exiled from is to deny our body's physical experience of place, and becomes really an easy excuse to dissociate from a current here-ness that I think is really important, that's really enriching, and that kind of comes with its own host of nuance and of problematics that are really, really worth investigating. But I'm going to leave that point there and just kind of dig in. So as Sarah mentioned, in my practice, I've always been interested in ideas of place, but especially how we perceive place, and then how we perceive our surroundings and how we imbue them with our own sense of placehood, how we start to give them parts of ourselves, and how these carefully placed spaces start to shape how we perceive ourselves. Early in my work, I really took these questions kind of autobiographically and just ran with it. This project I did when I was a fellow with SEAF. I did this. This is about 15 minutes from where I was born. I don't know if those structures were there when I was born, but if somebody does, let me know. But my starting point here was this sort of self-centered existential question of how did I get here? What is the series of convoluted events that led to me being here, a resident of the UAE, born here and living my whole life here, but also still Syrian. I went to Syria almost every summer up until 2010. And I have a bit of a Syrian slant to my dialect, and also very, very much a Palestinian. While I was doing this project, I spent a lot of time listening to a recording of my grandfather talking about his experience of the Nakba and moving from Palestine to Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, back to Jordan, and then eventually settling in Syria, where he stayed in outside of Aleppo in Nera camp. And I had really wanted to think about that moving. I wanted to think about how the sense of Palestinian actually managed to persist so strongly across sort of this vast geography, and also across generations, despite many of us having no physical contact with the place. And so I took some cues from his description of specific spaces that he stayed in while he was moving. And I built this simple structure. This is the summer of 2015, and this project kind of carried on until winter 2016. And so I built the structure, I took it down, moved it, rebuilt it again somewhere else. I did this a few different times across Abu Dhabi, a couple of times in Dubai later in the year. And eventually I started to feel like the pieces of the structure themselves started to carry an importance that went beyond the initial prescriptions I had for them. The more the pieces moved, the less I felt they needed to stay so faithful to the details that prescribed their form from the recorded narrative. I felt that the individual elements of the structure started to develop their own character. They started to kind of get imbued with an Abu Dhabi-ness or a Dubai-ness that was not entirely separate from their conceptual origin, but it also was not equivalent to it. And similar to how I felt that these materials began to drink in their surroundings, I started to think of how the body took in its environment. I started to think of it as though it is cast into a mold that is our surroundings, that is our hometowns or grandparents' gardens or our childhood bedrooms. And I felt like all of these were mold pieces that our bodies either form in or that actually push against our bodies, kind of like braces, until we morph within them. And so I started to look for traces of these molds in our forms. I started to look at the negative spaces between our contours, at evidence of pasts embodied between flesh, in cavities, the spaces between our toes, behind our necks, in our ears, And this line of investigation very quickly brought me to the space of the mouth. A space of genesis, of the origin of speech in our bodies. I think of the mouth as the birthplace of words. And I found myself really interested in the psychological and conceptual space that is the back of the throat, where words have started to come to be, but did not quite yet. I was interested in the hard palate under which they prepared to leave. I'm interested in the space behind the teeth, the gatekeepers, and the secret holders. After all, our body's first interaction with the world is always through our mouths. So it's no surprise that when we're faced with upheaval of any kind, be it personal or social, economic, political, or a strange health crisis that the whole world is living through, our mouths are the first to respond. This is a quote. A voice exists in voicing, on its materiality, physical, erotic, and uninhabitable. A world is being built in the projected intervals of image, words, music, and silence. This is a quote from artist and filmmaker and critic Trinity Minha's book called Elsewhere Within Here, which I recommend to everyone. In my studio, I had many questions for my mouth. Willem Flusser, who's a Czech philosopher of technology and nature, writes in his book, Gestures, if you lie in wait for a word at the moment it comes out of the mouth, try to catch it, to chew it before it is spit out, and that would actually be to grasp the gesture of speaking. You notice that you are always a second too late. Somewhere, somehow, before pronunciation and behind the mouth, the word has already been formed. Okay, sure. But I did wonder if I could capture the space of the mouth anyway, mid-utterance. I wondered, could I record the information encoded in the space of the mouth before it becomes words? Before I arrive at the pronunciation, or before pronunciation is even conceived of? I wondered if my mouth could encode speech in a medium other than sound. And what would that do to the words? Would that make them impotent? Would that make pre-sound permanent? Immortal? I wondered what happens when speech doesn't come out as words, when it sits inside for too long. Does it fester, break open like pustules on the tongue, ulcers in your cheeks? Do those words continue to be silent? Spent the last couple of years in the US pursuing graduate studies. And while there, feeling very, very far, I found myself opening up boxes in my head that I somehow seem to have taught myself to stay away from. Being a couple of continents away, it felt far enough, elsewhere enough, for me to investigate a removed experience of places I felt I should be close to. I was becoming interested in a certain manifestation of speech and of silence. And in 2011, I had started hearing words I couldn't remember ingesting in sound before, only in text. Biruh, bidam, by soul, by blood. A chant that I saw frequently growing up on posters and bumper stickers and graffitied and scribbled across Aleppo's walls and down her streets. And I had heard it in my head, but I found it really jarring in my ears. And just thinking about speaking them, just bringing the words to my mouth, brought bile along with them. And I only heard them through screens. The chants were always at least once removed from my reality. But once they sat in my ears, I couldn't get them out of my head, and it felt like the bile never left my mouth. So I decided to exercise, to cleanse my mouth, to eject the words and the bile. And I asked, what form do these caustic words take when they escape? Were chants just soft words when they were still clouds adrift in our bodies before they became chants? Just words sitting inside, pressing together until they finally calcify, not clouds anymore, but slow rock. And around them, these word rocks, were tongues morphing? Teeth, the teeth that were ground to keep these old harmless clouds in, did they bleed, then break, and then around their debris regrew anew? Like fangs, pointed, sharp, oral sclerosis. I was starting to become aware of how I fell back on language as a process that helped me navigate my removal from places that I did really wish that I was closer to. And in some cases, I felt like language was my bridge to assert a sense of belonging to a place. And while in grad school, I started to dig into Palestinian literature, looking for that bridge. And I found myself gravitating towards a very specific poetic genre.
أدب المقاومة نخلق إحنا الأمل في نفوس الأجيال القادمة، نخلق في روحهم إنه بالإمكان تحقيق حياة أفضل من الحياة اللي عايشينها، مش إنه المقاومة أقاوم في كل شيء، أقاوم بيومي بالأغنية بالقصيدة بالشعر بالحياة، إنه التأكيد على الحياة مش التأكيد على فكرة الموت وفكرة النهاية. هذا اللي بقوله أنا، فكرة التصدي للمهمات اللي تطرحها الحياة اليومية على الفرد على الإنسان. ما لازم إنه نفهم المقاومة إنه المقاومة بس فعل نضالي فعل عسكري، لا، فعل حياة، إنه كيف نبني حياة أفضل لأولادنا القادمين.
This is Maysair, a poet whose life's work actually was more in politics rather than poetry. And I first became interested in May's work after spending some time with Ghassan Kanafani's seminal study of Palestinian literature under the Israeli occupation. In this study, sorry, I'm losing my notes. In this study, Kanafani coins the term literature of resistance. Essentially, the literary corpus that grew out of Palestine, adab al-dakhil, literature from within. He defines this genre of literature against literature of exile, al-kharij, literature from without, a genre with ancestry that really stretches back almost a whole century and crosses over with various global traditions. But I found myself definitely more drawn to the poetic flora that came out of the land itself, literature from within. And I was in America, but I really wanted to be amongst the words of Palestine. And I hope that it would be a portal to experiences I feel sometimes that I could have had, but for like a small leap of faith, I guess. In Kanafani's study, he surveyed 13 poets, 2 playwrights, and authors of more than 20 scholarly citations. All of them were men, which I found a little bit odd because in that same book, Kanafani traces the most popular form of literature of resistance, which is poetry of resistance, to the tradition of improvised oral poetry and ululations, which is an overwhelmingly feminine genre. And so I sort of started to dig into a few different scholars and eventually kind of landed on May. And I found her really interesting because, not just because of her poetic output, but because she actually has a comparable resume to Kanafani and a parallel raison d'etre. But her philosophy is morphed along with her political parties. And I think anyone that knows a little bit about Kanafani's views on forms of resistance can see that kind of discord, even from the very brief clip I just played. Al-Sayegh was born in Gaza in 1940s. She was only 4 years younger than Kanafani, and she also was very active at various capacities with the PLO, and played a very strong role in the organization's cultural work. So she was the Secretary General of the General Union of Palestinian Women for 15 years. And she also was the editor of Palestine Thawra. Some of you might know Kanafani edited Al-Hadaf. She also actually very deliberately distinguishes herself from Kanafani. She says that she has a different reality of the inside of Palestine. She actually was able to come back to Gaza after years of political exile. And so she says she has a different idea of what poetry from within should look like. This is a quote from her in, I think in that same interview actually. She says, Ghassan Kanafani in his book, Returning to Haifa, writes about a theoretical return, writes in a poetic way. But when we write about the return, we write about an amputated joy. I was looking for a dream, and then everything becomes normal and trivial. The air was different, the trees different. This place is yours, it belongs to you, but it is incomplete, and you want to complete it, which is the sad thing. You're living your dream, but it's incomplete and you want to complete it. And I've always sort of felt a very strange and rather shameful reluctance towards the idea of return. I feel constantly haunted by a recording I have of my grandfather kind of derisively laughing when the interviewer asked him what he thought about the right of return. And I do think often about how that's probably informed by my very minuscule and muffled and mediated experience of a Nakba, in the same way that my experience of any event, of all the events that have been happening in Syria is so minuscule, muffled, and mediated. While thinking about that last year, in a talk I gave, I read one of May's poems in Arabic with my translation of it on a screen. And I admit I sort of balked at the thought of offering up her words so mediated by mine and so easily consumable to a Western art audience, basically, a Western art school audience. And so I doubled up the English as though it were a three-dimensional image seen without stereoscopic glasses. I had wanted to talk about the poetry. I wanted to talk about the sea. Here, May borrows a romantic tradition, capital R romantic, using nature in a sort of melancholy, abstract way. But she uses a very specific sea rather than the generic idea of a sea that is common in works like Gibran's, for example. Here it is specifically the Sea of Gaza. In this piece, I sort of thought lacking Arabic, like lacking stereoscopic glasses, meant lacking a tool that lets you perceive depth. In this case, the depth of this poetry. I wanted to emphasize the rift in experience that my process of translation and mediation caused, the deviation from the ontology of May's poem, if you know, so to speak. Aside from two Arabic speakers in the room, everyone unanimously kind of reported that they'd given up on reading early in the performance and instead, quote unquote, let the beautiful sound of the language wash over them. In a way, it seemed that I had inadvertently accomplished what casting my mouth mid-utterance did. By attempting to recommunicate, I rendered the words mute and impotent. I never really had the conversation about the poetry of the place or about the specific sea, etc. That never really ended up taking place. And I felt like I really struggled with this problem of having to constantly translate experience. And I became really interested in this rift, in this gap, and also in the legibility threshold that I seem to have crossed in that previous piece in the performance. And I wondered how much can I highlight the mediation of translation before it becomes too difficult to engage with. One collective that I kind of really enjoyed reading their work, they're called Antenna. It's an artist collective and professional interpreters. They coined the term ultra translation. They define it in a collaborative paper they wrote titled A Manifesto for Ultra Translation. I'm just going to read a couple of their bullet points in there. Translation is an asymptote. No matter how close we try to get, there's always a space between the two bodies, and that is the space where we live, the space where we transpose or are transposed. Work across languages needs contextualization. ultra-translation attempts to contextualize from within the language, within the syntax, between and around the words, the breath, the utterance, air and diaphragm contracting and relaxing. Ultra-translation, an awareness or hum or breath. Not all translation is ultra-translation. Ultra-translation is moments within translation, a part of translation, parting it to expose the irreducible gaps. Ultra-translation bubbles up from translation, moves translation somewhere else, transposes it. In this piece, a lot of the formal decisions were really direct consequences of what I felt was the failure of the previous one. Here I really was thinking of this in-betweenness. I wrote these vignettes on airplanes, and I was really thinking of what it meant to fly over water to arrive at land, what it meant to be in between places. And I was thinking of the sea as the opposite of land, as sort of almost the anti-national identity. But again, I didn't really want to offer up any of these things directly. But I also didn't want to completely block out readability. I was really interested in how much can I make somebody aware of the fact that these narratives are being frozen for a second for consumption, and then actually allow the consumption to happen, because that's where actually dialogue and sort of some form of insight can come through. But I also, in this piece, this is just a small kind of grainy foam video of the piece in space, and a little detail shot. But another thing that sort of really interested me here is that I wanted to see what the text did when it existed in two places. One place that felt that was projected, you know, on the floor. You can kind of see it in the detail shots behind the screen. It's clear, it's legible, and again, it also exists at the same time on the screen, where it is once removed from its projection, it's bounced off of the floor onto the screen, and it's alive and dynamic and growing and changing. And it's kind of, and it's that sort of being both ways, it's what was starting to really interest me. But I left that body of work feeling kind of really dissatisfied. And even in preparing this presentation for today, I keep conjuring up these kind of feelings of discontent that I think came really from feeling like I constantly had to be performing a relationship to place, not just in my art practice, but in general, because that relationship really only existed in its performance. You know, May said, when we write about an amputated joy. And I still spend a lot of time with this line. And I think a lot about this mountain we build of the idea of the place you are exiled from, or you are away from, of the idea of return. And honestly, in particularly virulent kind of angry moments, I think it's really absurd how we are able to maintain this unendingly painful long distance relationship with places like Palestine, like any other place that you spend a lot of time with and then were removed from, or feel a sort of affinity to, and we continue to ignore places directly underneath our feet. But I also know that the way we think about things like origin or homeland or nationality or citizenship, etc., all of these are kind of very one-dimensional ways of expressing how we build ourselves in reference to the geographies on which we exist. And these are kind of the questions that I want to think more about now. I want to kind of think more about the current here of our bodies, not as divorced from all these elsewheres that we build relationships with, but rather kind of as an assemblage of all these different places, or a layering. And I'm arriving at the end of this, but I'll leave you with this question that I'm currently thinking about, which is how can we honor the physical weight of our bodies on the ground without thinning out the strength of our tethers to our many elsewheres? And that's all I have for you today, at least in presentation format. Thank you guys for listening.
Thank you so much, Mais, for all you presented and also just sharing your process and your thoughts and your questions with us as well. Um, I know I have quite a bit of questions of my own, but if anyone would like to unmute and ask their question, now would be the time. Um, and if not, then I will go ahead with my questions.
I mean, I do have a lot of questions, but the first thing that jumped up, you said something about the difference between the land and the sea, and how the sea kind of doesn't have, it's like anti-national, but there is, I mean, I think even like when it comes to the sea, there are borders and there are like الحدود البحرية, and there's like a lot of politics that go into that, and it's sort of even more complicated. But I'm kind of wondering with your perspective, like what is the difference between the sea and the land?
Yeah, that was a part of the work that I started to touch on and never really got into. But I was thinking of the sea almost as the Gibranian, like capital R romantic thing, which is the, and I was thinking of it literally while on airplanes. I kind of was thinking of these stretches in between places where we attach so much of our identities to, basically. And you're right, I mean, it is sort of like a very, very fraught geography to think about. And the beginning of that work got completely derailed by, and you know, I say derailed, but not necessarily in a negative way, but I kind of really started thinking a lot more about this idea of who am I even talking to about this, basically. I know that doesn't really answer your question, but I don't have an answer for it exactly. Yeah.
Also, is that a thing that you kind of like, that kind of forms your work, is trying to define who the audience is? Because I feel like a lot of it is sort of your kind of journey into understanding your relationship with the land or with identity and like all of this. So I think, but does it make a difference when you're trying to kind of understand your relationship to this thing, and you're kind of understanding it through making work, but then you kind of have to like think of the audience and who you're showing it with, and does that kind of dictate some of the choices that you make when you're making the work? Does that make sense?
Not initially, no. A lot of the research, I mean, and this is why I actually wanted to show the SEAF project in the beginning, because that really kind of came from a very kind of, I said it, self-centered and existential, which I think is fine. I'm still kind of self-centered and existential in my work, but not in the beginning. But it unfortunately was a wall that I was hitting repeatedly, and I felt like the conversation was not yielding what I needed it to yield. And so, what I did is I was like, okay, what are the conversations that I can have where I am at the moment? And this is also part of the reason why I'm starting to really shift how I think about place now that I'm here. I think we can have very different conversations here about these issues than I could when I was in the US. Thanks for that, Malak.
Hi, Mace. I had a question and then I forgot it, but I'm going to try to come up with something. I think it's related to when you spoke about at the end about this idea of weight and having and what it means to have weight in a particular place, and if that's associated to belonging. And I guess that just brought up ideas related to your previous works and how a lot of it incorporated projection. And I mean, at least for me, I associate projection with a kind of weightlessness. And so I'm just wondering how you're going about thinking about those two opposing ideas.
Yeah, I mean, every time I've used projections, I really was thinking about how transformative light is in a space while still being as non-material as possible. When I'm definitely now, I mean, I'm really interested in those two strange kind of dichotomies of having no weight, but also it's our physical body is in a place. And, and sometimes, I mean, it's also just interesting as you're asking the question, I'm thinking of weight metaphorically as well. What does it mean to carry weight into, in a specific place, and who has more weight than others? But how am I thinking of it? I mean, and again, this is the part of research that I'm still articulating right now, but I think the ephemerality of light, or not the ephemerality, but sort of this like lightness or statelessness of light, is still really interesting because it relates to a lot of how we have these conversations now. And I think it might be the kind of material that could carry ideas of this, the multiples or the layering. But at the same time, there's some conversation that needs to happen about actually the agency of our body on a place, in the same way like that it has agency in a space when you're doing a performance, for example, or you're voicing out something. And so I don't know, but I mean, these are the things that I'm thinking about right now.
Yeah, I mean, I also think about what it means to be displaced, and if you are, and when you are forced to, leave a place, evacuate, and you carry your belongings and your objects with you. How much does that weigh versus, if you were to just, carry everything in a hard drive? If everything is digital, then, your home can exist in this sort of weightless space.
Yeah, I'm thinking, I'm blanking out on the artist's name, but I'm thinking of the person that used to take out 3D prints of archaeological objects in USB drives. I'm not going to remember their name, but yeah, I mean, yeah, it's interesting because it kind of goes back to kind of thinking of cinder blocks as these materials that start to kind of carry or sort of imbue themselves with characters of what's around them. I don't know. I mean, well, I don't know what your question is exactly, but okay. But I think it is really interesting because also, I mean, in the same way, I'm not necessarily interested anymore in specifically that narrative of when you're displaced, what do you take with you? I think there are other maybe kind of more complicated narratives that we can start to talk about, or that I can talk about better than that, I think. But that idea of like, we also exist in the digital, like your home could exist in a hard drive, is really interesting to me. And I mean, we're having this conversation here, so I don't know.
Hi, Mace.
Hi, I'm not sure who's talking, sorry. Oh, Nadine, hi.
I actually really loved, following on Nasser's comment, the idea of the space, or let's say the place that words occupy before they are formed. So this sense, because sometimes we speak before we can even think our thoughts, right? So I loved this sense, again, following on what Nasser is saying, giving form to words. You trying to make material something that's not material, that's quite immaterial, in fact, but has maybe impact that is very physical. And then how you articulated your relationship to long distant homes as almost like as unrequited love, in a sense. And then, linking that to your relationship to language, which seems to me to carry that similar feeling of the space before things are formed, made me think that maybe in your art you are trying to recreate those places and relationships every time. So the way your art is moving seems to articulate that painful or amputated joy that you were, describing, which is, other ways of looking at writing. If you look at Slavoj Žižek, also talks about the pain that comes with articulating, with expression. So I don't really have a question, but I'm just wondering how you could perhaps maybe tell us a bit more about how language and place are linked in a way that's beyond language. Because, you're working between languages, you're looking at liminality, you're looking at spaces that exist in our minds or in our memories. So I'm just wondering if maybe there's a way to bring those two together in terms of how your work kind of evolved from looking at very specific places to looking at trying to give a place to something that doesn't have space. Do you know what I mean? I don't know if this makes sense.
I mean, that last sentence is interesting. Trying to give place to something that doesn't have space feels like what we do with the internet.
Right.
All the time. And yeah, okay, so there was a lot in that. I mean, I really am still very much fascinated with sort of where language exists in the body before it becomes, or before a recipient can receive it. And a lot of that kind of curiosity came from feeling like initially, before the work started becoming motivated by feeling like I'm stuck constantly translating experience. It started from feeling like I can't begin to articulate experience. And I guess that doesn't necessarily tie to place, but I think that's something that we tend to relegate to language used to describe our experience in place, language used to kind of, what I'm trying to say is I think we don't always look for how we want to articulate our own narrative, and rather kind of take cues from how things are described. I mean, one thing is the part of my frustration with the narrative of like a Palestinian refugee. I'm just going to do a small kind of harmless call out, but an article written about me at some point ran with the headline "Stateless and Eager to Explore." And I was doing work kind of thinking about this term stateless because I've never heard it before I moved to the US. And then to see it actually printed was kind of really, really absurd. And it made me wonder, like, why do I constantly have to work through the terms being thrown at me rather than start to think from within about the terms to describe these experiences? I know I'm going off on a tangent, but I'm trying to kind of get at that, like, the thing that is before pronunciation is really important, and we don't spend enough time with it. And I don't know what to do with that yet. I mean, I'm doing things with it, but, there's no resolution for it, I guess, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that the thing before language is primordial. So in a way, the bile was a rejection of language that was coming from without, not from within. So, it was interesting that you kind of needed to maybe express this inner resistance or inner rejection or revulsion through a form, which also wasn't solid from what I saw, but calcified, or it was made solid, let's say. So yeah, I mean, I sense that maybe you're using like the way in which you express this, difficulty in putting a sitemap on something is through language, but also through the impossibility or through where language fails, like you've mentioned, through the internet space and things like that. But anyway, thanks. I know it was complicated.
Thank you, Nadia.
Hi, Mace. I had a question as well. I was really interested in, when you were kind of speaking about this the weight and projection, and it got me thinking, you know, seeing your the projected text on the ground and on the wall, and I was just sort of thinking in my head, like, wow, like, you know, how does it feel to sort of, sorry, my cat, how does it feel to, like, you know, feel the weight of a text or a word, and then have that, like you said, projection kind of feels almost weightless. And so to have those kind of, that contrast of like maybe weighted text, weighted words, weighted meaning, and then, you know, the sort of like lightness of the projection. And I think I'm just kind of asking more your process and how you sort of come about that. And something else that was super interesting that you said is that, you know, like the having it being stored in your body before you can like articulate it. So I don't know if you can maybe just like touch on those 2 points again. I'd be really, really interested and grateful.
Okay, wait, I'll ask you to repeat the second point in a minute. But,
okay.
Okay, so you're sort of just asking about process. I'm just gonna actually pull out the PowerPoint again and show you a couple of.
Please, that'd be amazing.
Yeah, 1 second. This is gonna be like the back door of the PowerPoint. Because I did spend some time kind of actually wanting to be inside the light or inside the text and kind of try to give it as much. Well, I basically wanted to completely transform a space with an immaterial material, or as immaterial a material as I could find. And if what you're asking is process, if I understood that correctly, really it was me in a studio space with a projector, trying things out. And but I mean, a lot of it also came from playing with a bunch of different materials, because actually, and I don't have an installation shot of this, but this piece came from trying to think about how can the video itself affect the space that it's in. I'm just gonna close this. And I intentionally kind of had the video kind of drop down, and just kind of like the lower, maybe a quarter or 1/3 of the video is lit and the rest of it is dark, because I was kind of looking at what happens when the room gets dark for, you know, somebody that's, you know, so the room gets dark suddenly, and then you have this really intense kind of visceral, whatever, regurgitating experience thing. But that's one thing. I mean, this is also a projection of a projection on my body. And in here, I mean, kind of going back to that thing about weight and lightness, and them not necessarily meaning no effect, I guess. When I was thinking about mediation and sort of the mediated experience, and I was thinking about things that were happening that felt like were really important to me, and yet I wasn't really part of them. And so to me, that sort of the light kind of only surface level transforming the body was really important, because I had to acknowledge that removal. And I had to acknowledge that removal, but I still also felt like there are things I wanted to work through despite the removal, basically. I don't know, I think that kind of gives you a little bit of a glimpse into process. Can you repeat the second part of the question? Sorry.
No, yeah, you totally answered it. I think it's more, now seeing this, it's like this idea of like, you know, when you're feeling something, it's in your body, and you feel, you know, somewhat this phase of discovery of like, okay, how am I going to articulate this? How am I going to put it together? But then once you know, do you feel like it's like you're connected, but then disconnected? And the idea of like weight and projection, and this idea of contrast and how it lives sort of in between. I don't know if I'm making sense now, but
I know what you're saying, because you're kind of talking about like the moment before you actually arrive at a word, because once you arrive at the word, it's sort of frozen in that moment and there's no more flux in it. And
you're adding so much flux with the projection, you know, so that's sort of like where I find myself really gravitated you know, within your work. So yeah, you completely answered everything. Thank you so much.
Good questions. Thanks, Sarah.
And talking about weight, because I feel like everyone's mentioning weight, do you feel like there's a sense of like weight and burdens and responsibility that comes with this identity that's sort of also inherited? I mean, you talked about you've never visited the land itself, but you live it through your grandfather's recordings and like your parents' memories or their parents' memories, and sort of passed down. And then does it ever feel like it's a weight on you that you kind of have to represent or explain to others?
It definitely sometimes feels that way, but I feel like that's like, I mean, that's this, not the struggle, but that's the conversation, right? Because it shouldn't be. And that's kind of what I'm starting to think of a lot now, which is, I mean, no one person can represent everything, but everyone is part of this, like a collective experience of something, with whatever this thing is. And I think for me, it's been just trying to find what is it that is genuinely my experience and not a projected experience. And this is kind of why I really am like itching to look at myself, like at what the experience of being Palestinian, Syrian in Abu Dhabi is, very specifically. And this is kind of like what I'm kind of mired in the middle of now. But I don't know. I mean, there's no like answer to the feeling of it being a burden other than like you own up only to the parts that are yours, or at least this is what I tell myself. I don't know. Yeah. Sorry, I don't have an answer to that.
We have a few minutes left, so I'm gonna ask one of my questions. So with the mouthpieces that almost look like jewels in a sense, I was wondering, like, what were you trying to capture, or what were you saying when you were like casting those? And the second is like, does it almost ground the piece for you? Does it solidify or physicalize the words? Because you were talking about like sound being ephemeral, or like, no, sorry, words being ephemeral, but the sound being that as well, but you're trying to use a different medium to represent that. So if you could just talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, there are two things that I'm casting in the series of things I just showed you. And the first one, and this kind of ties to a few other things that I was working on simultaneously as I kind of was working on this body work. I was kind of, as I was doing this, I was really interested in, I was digging into this 8th century Arabic manuscript by Jabir bin Hayyan, where he wrote this recipe recipe for making a person. And I just kind of was really interested in what did a Muslim scientist in the 8th century think are prerequisites for being a person. And so I was kind of, I was playing with these ideas, and he has, you know, he's credited with this philosophy of takween, of creation, which is kind of like a Muslim vein of thought, like an Islamic vein of thought. And I was just really interested in this idea of like how we understand through script, through these sort of different scripts, creation, and kind of how that might tie with how our body is shift and change kind of in response to their surroundings. And so here specifically, I'm sort of, I'm thinking of casting kun fayakun. So the line from Quran, which is God's kind of command to things to be, for things to be. And I'm just, and what's really interesting here, I think, at least kind of what gets me really interested, is the fact that when you're casting the inside of your mouth, it really only casts the vowels, huruf al-illa. And this is really interesting for me because I'm digging into this a little bit more now, where I'm looking at the linguistic tradition and kind of how it was set, and the sort of socio-political context in that it was sort of being defined within. And I just think the fact that we call vowels حروف العلة is really, really interesting. So حروف العلة means the letters that are unwell or that are sick or that are ill. And in some of sort of like really big, you know, like Sibawayh's book, which is kind of the first most comprehensive, the first comprehensive study of Arabic linguistics, kind of defines حروف العلة. It says the vowels are unwell because they are susceptible to change, and change is something that accompanies illness, basically. Change and I think the other word is I can't remember. A change in kind of temperamentality, and so I just, you know, I thought it's kind of really interesting that when we're thinking of the negative space of the mouth, it's never the consonants; it's actually those sounds, those changeable sounds, or those sounds. And the other one, so this is kind of a direct accompaniment to this, where I was casting the chant, and again, it ends up being just the vowel sounds. Sorry, can you repeat the second? Did I answer your question? Is there a second part? I forgot.
The second one is about like, does it ground the word for you? Or like solidify it? Yeah.
I don't know if it exactly does that. I mean, to me, it's sort of like this is part of, this is a consequence of a failure of language. But at the same time, it kind of feels like it's a triumph over language in a sense. Because it's there and it's sort of immortal, and it's kind of intimately from the body, but at the same time it's completely mute and impotent. And so I don't know if it exactly solidifies the work, because I feel like the things that I was really interested in show up here, and that this is a I don't know what the word to use for this, but it's not exactly a consequence, but it's it is part, I mean, it's part of kind of the ensemble, but it's not the essence of it. I wouldn't say it's sort of like the center of it, but that's it. Yeah.
All right. Well, it is 9, so I think we're gonna close off the session. But just a few notes to look out for. Mace had a studio visit, a digital studio visit with Warehouse 421, which is gonna come out tomorrow, so look out for that. And as part of the critical practice program of Tashkeel, she's gonna have a show in the fall. So that's also something to look forward to. Her work will be showcased there. Yeah, so thank you everyone for joining today, and special thank you to Mace, who just agreed to be a part of this and to share your time and your thoughts. So thank you so much.
Thank you for everyone that's here.
Thank you, everyone.
All right.